Thanks for doing this interview, Roman. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
I was thinking maybe we could start with you helping us to understand the nature of your work in the center and how you came to do this work.
Well, you know, as I think about the last 14 or 15 years, I realized that the Pykoff Chair in the Western Canadian Centre for Deaf Studies is had a very similar trajectory as my center. We were both imagined and brought into existence in the era of multiculturalism, when the federal and provincial governments were supporting minority cultures in Alberta. And I came to learn, talking with Michael over the years, about how his center came to be, that it was the same process. He followed the same process that I followed, but we didn't know each other. We're doing the same sort of thing, and even with the same person in the federal government who was helping us, but independently of each other. And it was only in later years that I came to realize that we both ended up having endowed chairs with centers devoted to a particular field of study. So in my case, I helped to create and still run the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at MacEwan University. And our purpose is to encourage research and then act on that research to intervene in a development process, particularly in Ukraine, but also with the Ukrainian community here in Canada. So over the years, we've been involved in projects, in a variety of projects. We've been involved in business education in Ukraine, in transferring nursing curricula to Ukraine, in agro-business. We've had exchange of farmers and so on. All of this done not solely on our own resources, because we're a very small staff, but all in partnership with content experts in each of these areas. So my center is in the business of doing applied research, understanding where there's a possibility for a project, looking for funds, looking for people to carry out the project, putting the whole team together, and then carrying out those projects to make a difference. And in a variety of fields, I think both in Canada and Ukraine, our center at MacEwan has had some impact. And I like to think that we've done that in the field of deaf studies, and we'll continue to be doing it for a few more years at any rate. So that's how our two centers have come to work together for almost 15 years now.
And your center is older than 15 years, though?
We were created in 1987. When was...
86.
86, yes. So it's almost simultaneously. But as I say, we didn't know each other, or even that we were doing this. I think it was just in the spirit of the times that government and community politics was such that minority cultures were being supported. And I ran with that idea in the Ukrainian community, and of course, Michael Rodda ran with that idea in the field of deafness and hard of hearing studies.
And is there a center that's like your center in any other place across Canada?
No, there is here at the University of Alberta a number of other centers in Ukrainian studies. So we have there's a center in modern history, contemporary history. There's the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies that incorporates a variety of such projects in language education, in folklore studies. But there is not a research and development center devoted to engaging with contemporary issues. And so ours is the only one in Canada.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so then it sounds like in that course of history, your paths crossed and you and Michael met, perhaps through EHOR, I'm not sure.
Yes.
Can you describe a little bit about how that happened?
Well, we were a fairly young center, initially focusing on Ukrainian Canadian projects in dance and culture and choral music and so on, in the arts in particular. But in 1991, the Soviet Union, which had been an enormous political entity with 15 different republics in it, essentially dissolved almost overnight in the space of a few years. This is what some people would call an empire, really a state of over 250 million people and so on. Something that rivaled the United States in power at the time. It simply collapsed on its own inefficiency, it bankrupted itself as a country, financially and morally in many respects, politically. And out of it emerged independent countries, 15 independent countries, one of which was Ukraine. And perhaps the most westernly oriented of all of the other countries that were made up the Soviet Union. So when that happened, there began a lot of contact between West and East, because travel to the Soviet Union had been very limited since World War II, at the end of World War II. And people needed to meet each other and needed simply to understand how these two societies might interact in the future. And my center at that point turned its attention to working with projects in Ukraine. And we engaged, as I say, in the agribusiness area with business education and so on. And continue to do that to the present time, because the need continues to be there to modernize their educational system and westernize it so that it's a more democratic and more open society. So it was at that point that one day a lady walked into my office and started talking to me about her brother, Ihor Kobel, who worked at the School for the Deaf in Lviv, and asked if there was any way that our center might make it possible for him to come to Edmonton and to engage the deaf community here and to compare their system of education with the one here. So I agreed, and Ihor Kobel traveled to Edmonton and spent a considerable amount of time with the Alberta School for the Deaf. And during that visit, visited the University of Alberta and met Michael Rodda. Mm-hmm. And so it was this third person, his presence, that brought Michael and myself together and brought our centers together into a working relationship. And as I say, the rest is history, because Michael and I, in many ways, found it very easy to work with one another. I think I could understand his passion and his commitment to his field. And he certainly was open to learning about mine. It was an ongoing learning process for both of us. But I very quickly understood that he was an individual of, not only great commitment, but of sort of, I might even call him a warrior for his field. He fought absolutely the good fight in a pragmatic way.
Yes.
Everything, he'd been through many struggles to achieve the center, to create the Peikoff Endowment, and I have no doubt lost as many as he perhaps won, because that's simply the nature of that kind of role, that you don't win them all. But we understood each other, and he showed an immediate willingness to travel, to engage his students in this field of deafness in Ukraine. And he showed a willingness to, to learn, to be open to all these experiences, new experiences. So I think we just hit it off and began trying to see where this would go, this combination of deafness and learning about the former Soviet Union and how we might intervene in that society.
And so then what was the first project-oriented work that you did together in Ukraine?
Well, with Ihor Kobel's stimulating us to visit Ukraine, we decided in '99 to visit Ukraine. And really there were two institutions that we were able to visit at the time. One was Ihor Kobil's school. We needed to actually visit the School for the Deaf in Lviv, which is in Western Ukraine. But then we also needed to visit the university that Ihor graduated from with his second degree in deafness studies, and that's the Romanov National Pedagogical University in the city of Kyiv. As it turned out, that university is was the one and only primary university dealing with deafness at the time. Much has changed since those years, but there was, at the center of their system was this university and these programs, and so we met with them and met with the leader of their program, Dr. Fomicheva, who in February, I think, of 2000, then returned the visit here.
Yes.
And came with their most senior person, Yarmochenko, who actually was the leading authority who created the new Academy of Pedagogical Science of Ukraine after independence.
Okay.
There's a lot to explain here, but the Soviet system was organized on a vertical basis, and we needed to learn how to operate in that system because decisions around changes to curricula, changes to programs, rested in the hands of a small group of people at the top of the pinnacle. So change had to come from top down. And so knowing that, they both came to Canada, where Michael introduced them very much to various programs we have in deafness studies here in Edmonton. And particularly talked to them about sign language.
Okay.
And the importance of sign language. The reason being is that the Soviet system had taken on a philosophy that emerged in the 1920s, as I understand it, of lip reading as the primary way of teaching. And being a very bureaucratized system, once they had accepted that philosophy, they simply carried it forward for the next 70 years. There was very difficult, despite people trying there to modernize and change their form of pedagogy, it was very difficult to do away with those original principles. And so when we've arrived in Ukraine, I always like to tell this story about how when you enter a school, there are 10 rules sort of posted on a board. And there is one of the rules clearly written that sign language was disallowed as a language for the educational process for teaching. Kids, of course, communicate in sign language, and Michael could see that, and many of the teachers communicate with the children, but formally the state had banned sign language as a form of communication in the teaching process. So Michael, I think, had decided then that that was something he was going to change. And from the very beginning, he advocated for both for Dr. Fomicheva and Yarmochenko to accept sign language. As it happened, Dr. Fomicheva never did change her opinion.
No.
And I think still holds it to this day.
Well, when we speak about warriors, I suspect that
Yes,
word
yes.
would describe her as well.
Michael never gave up on her. You know, for a dozen years or more, he maintained relationships and kept trying to persuade her. But Yarmochenko, on the other hand, even though he was older and so on, seemed to be supportive as soon as he could see the outcomes of teaching through sign language. And so what happened after this initial visit was that we decided to do several things. First of all, we decided to organize a summer camp. And Fomicheva, to her credit, assisted Michael fully. They arranged a beautiful location at Artek, which is a children's youth center in Crimea. And they had parents and teachers and students all come together. Really an unheard of practice prior to that. It seems a very simple idea to Westerners, of course, and normal practice in the West, but it was not normal for Soviet teachers of the deaf to consider the opinions of parents, and certainly not to listen to children. And the fact that Michael would bring them together in a recreational environment allowed people to interact as people and to appreciate each other, but then also to begin to learn various methods for teaching children through games and so on. He demonstrated various techniques from Western pedagogy for them. So this turned out to be the beginning of a series of summer camps that went on for over 10 years. And camps that were held all over Ukraine that involved perhaps as many as, well over 1,000 children and parents.
That's impressive.
And what happened is that the parents and the kids really took to this idea of using sign language. The children, quite naturally, because they already were users of sign language. And when Canadian students, like Anastasia Benza or others showed up, and Michael always argued that they should come on these trips, that he always made a point of involving students. And when the deaf kids in Ukraine met young people signing from Canada, they found a way to communicate very quickly. And the Ukrainian parents are absolutely shocked by this idea that foreigners could communicate with their children when they, as parents, for years from the birth of their child very often, were not able to communicate. And they couldn't understand why that was so, why their system didn't encourage sign language. So parents very quickly became advocates for sign language. And Michael, of course, knew that this would happen. And these summer camps made it possible to start a movement, really an action by parents where they began to learn more about signing and advocate for it. And of course, there were many teachers in these schools that became supporters of the parents and advocates themselves for using sign language. And so that was a very major contribution, I think, that Michael made, because once signing became legitimated by the presence of these Canadians and professors to boot, there's no stopping it. It's gone forward, and it's continuing year after year to earn its place in Ukrainian society, and particularly in the deaf community.
How did you fund those camps?
How did we find them?
How did you fund them? Like, where did that money come from? I mean, it's no small task to organize summer camps.
Well, again, this is something that, with Michael's help, we created a society, just a nonprofit society called the Canada-Ukraine Alliance for Deaf and Hard of Hearing persons. We created one here, and we created one in Ukraine.
Okay.
And these two societies carried the responsibility for organizing these summer camps and funding them. The Ukraine side carried the responsibility for the organization. And I must say, their schools also carried, they provided in-kind contributions in food and various different ways in busing costs and so on in Ukraine. But it was the Canadian side that provided the cash or the money that was needed to cover those areas that weren't covered by the schools in Ukraine. And so over the years, with the help of good people in the community here in Alberta in particular, but not only Alberta, people helped us from other places, including the Canadian Society for the Deaf, that processed our tax receipts and so on. But in general, we provided about $5,000 a year for over 10 years to allow these camps to be run. And it was a very good investment, and it had its effect. There's no doubt it's had its effect, and I believe it's still a very useful mechanism if one wants to make a social change.
Yes.
And you know, using a recreational environment to decide on a course of action and people returning home intent on achieving something before next summer's visit, it's a good strategy, and it worked well.
And the power of parents.
And the power of parents, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no stopping them once they make up their mind. Now, there's a lot still to be done, of course, because the Ukrainian Sign Language was not documented, with the exception of a couple of pamphlets that had been produced during the Soviet times. There were no handbooks or guidebooks, or that was before video and before the internet, of course. And so there really were no educational materials or resources.
Which is interesting, because Russian Sign Language has had some early research that parallels the American Sign Language in the late 60s. But again, Western and Eastern worlds, no exchange of information.
Yes, and it's a great shame, and it's something that is to be regretted that scientists and researchers didn't have freedom of communication and freedom of access to each other, because I'm sure both sides could learn much from each other, as was the case with this whole project. But Michael suggested that we begin to videotape people signing, various kinds of communications, and I remember buying this small video camera because the Ukrainian side didn't have the resources for it, and so they began to make videos and began to classify them, categorize them, until you came along and really took that project and mentored the Ukrainian side. In 2004, it should be said that the contact that Michael had made by doing this work with Professor Bondar at the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences. Bondar headed the Institute for Special Pedagogy, where deafness was located. And he was a very progressive person, and agreed to come to Canada and visit Michael in 2004. And at that time, we signed an agreement between University of Alberta, MacEwan University, the Rachmaninoff University, and particularly the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences. And so once the Academy was fully committed to advancing the cause of deaf studies, Professor Bondar created a research laboratory. Initially I had 8 positions, and I can recall, Deborah, you insisting that half of those positions be given to deaf persons who are deaf or persons who are fully fluent in sign language. This too was a big shock for Professor Bondar to employ people in these research institutes, which is considered a very high level of people who had perhaps no university training, or perhaps some university training, but certainly not postdoctoral training in research. But the authority the Canadians had developed or had grown to such a level that Professor Bondar listened to the advice he was given. He did employ people in this new research laboratory who relied on sign language, and began formally to do videotaping and research on Ukrainian Sign Language. And that too, I would say, is something that has been continuing since it's been started, and is now a part of the research agenda, a permanent part of the research agenda and structure of the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences. Which, it should be said, then led to sign language being allowed as a language of education for 2 hours a week, albeit so far it's only 2 hours a week, but it is now permitted by regulations of the Ministry of Education as a language for teaching purposes in the boarding schools where deaf students reside.
Those are major changes.
Those are major changes.
And started
so not
from-
only did sign language get legitimized and established with the parents, it has been now recognized as a legitimate subject for research in the institutions devoted for this purpose. So these are very significant changes which I do not believe will be reversed. On the contrary, they seem to be spreading and growing and gaining strength as teachers of the deaf begin taking advantage of these new openings and these new opportunities. So out of all of this process has come an association of teachers of the deaf in Ukraine. As I understand it, it's a national group, unlike Canada. We don't have such a national group in Canada. And they're very much advocates for the advancement of this field. So in all of these ways, Michael truly was a champion for the deaf students in Ukraine and teachers as well. And he brought his expertise and his willingness to be open to all these experiences and to kind of roll with it year in, year out. He, for, as I say, for close to 15 years, he worked at this while he was at the University of Alberta. And then once he retired, he came over to MacEwan University and continued to work at this with the Ukrainian Center at MacEwan University.
I don't think Michael ever really retired.
No.
You know, I think he may have moved institutions, but I don't think he retired. And one of my memories of being with Michael and you in the Ukraine the first time I went is that work is what he did. And so I think we began our mornings at 7, and we held meetings and traveled around and did the work of the project. And if we collapsed into bed around 10:30 at night, that was an early evening, it seems to me. But he was tireless, it seemed like, in that work. And yet could touch everyone from students to the highest level of political influencer. So can you tell me a little bit about how he and you then became academicians?
Ah, yes.
Where did that come from, and what is that?
Well, the concept of an academician in the former Soviet Union, and still is present in independent Ukraine, has to do with the structure of how education is structured. So unlike North America, in the former Soviet Union, and in some European countries, teaching and research are formally divided into two systems. So teaching takes place at colleges, universities in Ukraine, as it does here. But in Ukraine, there's an entire system devoted to research, so that in general, it's in every field. So it would be in physics, in the sciences, and in law, in medicine. There are separate, what are called academies. And these are pyramids of structure because the universities, colleges being at the bottom of the pyramid of students and professors, but out of that come a small group of people who enter into this research structure. So in addition to what role they might offer by way of teaching, they have a separate title as researchers. Who prepare PhDs in research in the field, as opposed to teachers in the field. So an academician would be someone at the top of his field and a member of the academy, of his own academy of medicine, law, or pedagogy, and would have perhaps 100, 200, some might have as many as 500 research under them, separate facilities, separate budgets, devoted solely to research. So the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences is the category that relates to the field of education of deaf students. And Michael was nominated as an international member of the Academy.
Are there many international members?
No, there are very few. In fact, the Academy itself, I think, has 120 members for Ukraine.
Right.
Ukraine being a country of, say, about 46 million today, with hundreds of post-secondary institutions. So you can imagine that if you're in the circle of 120 people
Yes.
in this research system, that you have prestige and an ability to operate that others do not. The Academy is also has a special role as advising government, education being a federal jurisdiction in Ukraine, advising the Ministry of Education about changes it might make to its system. So that when an academician and his institute, of course, and the research that goes into this kind of recommendation, puts forward a series of ideas to the ministry, those are listened to very carefully. And so Michael was able to influence people at the very top of this pyramid about sign language, about the need to study sign language and document it, about the need to speak to parents, about the early detection of deafness, about the social model of deafness as well as the medical model of how it might be looked at and dealt with. He was able to work very closely with Professor Bondar and other people at the Academy to communicate some of these ideas. This is that process of legitimation I talked about earlier, that it's because of Michael's status as a professor in Canada and his publications and so on that allowed him to speak on a peer basis with people in the Academy. And they thought highly enough of the recommendations and work that he did to offer him this honorary appointment, which he accepted and I think surely deserved. You know.
It seems like both of you surely deserve that honor. And it's clear that both of you operated from a systemic point of view. You know, that from what you've described, individual projects were important, but it seemed like both of you stood back and said, what would be the largest way to impact a society? And so it seems like you've worked the political processes, the government processes, the economic processes to bring around sustainable long-term change as opposed to a short-term project change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you're right that the end purpose is to improve the system and the services that are provided. But in Michael's case, and I think I learned a lot about this from him, is that he would start with very small things and just continue to leverage them into this larger picture. So, for example, this business of supporting students. I watched as he brought students right into the Alliance and would take them to Ukraine. So that a number of his younger students, like Amber Schultz, for example, was a student recently, I think in 2010, she went to the summer camp in Ukraine because of Michael's wish that a student be taken. Now, it worked the other way as well, because once the Ukrainians saw that he brought students, that kicked off another dynamic, and Ihor Kobel, who was a teacher, then approached Michael about becoming a master's student here at U of A. So Michael immediately picked up and acted on that, so Ihor Kobel, in fact, came to the University of Alberta, completed his master's and his PhD, financed to a large part by Michael's efforts through the University of Alberta, and his own work, of course, in doing the research and studies. And then Ihor returns now with a Canadian PhD to Ukraine and is invited to become a professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. So he had been a teacher in the School for the Deaf. Now he's been invited to work to develop programs for deaf students at the Ukrainian Catholic University, which allowed Ihor to be invited to Gallaudet University in Washington on a Fulbright scholarship so that he could learn more in his work. So you can see how Michael's insistent on having undergraduate students attend triggered other people to act in a way which eventually is a question of creating a new program.
Absolutely.
At a university. So I think these are very wise lessons that he demonstrated, and I learned from those kinds of attend to the smaller projects, because they certainly can become larger ones.
What I learned from Michael as well in that work is that it's about the importance of building relationships and long-term relationships, and letting them decide what they need, when they need it, why they need it, and being there to offer support and resources, but not necessarily leading, but having them lead. And so I think he left us with many lessons.
Yes, indeed.
For those of us who are remaining, unfortunately, Michael has passed now, and so we carry on his legacy in Ukraine. What do you think's next? What would Michael want us to do as the next steps?
Well, I think he'd be very, well, I know he's very impressed, because he saw you working on this question of codifying sign language in Ukraine and fighting for deaf teachers who are in the residential boarding schools to be given the role of teaching in sign language. They're there, the resource is there. It's just that even though some of these teachers, deaf teachers, have completed their Romanov University and so on, they have been underutilized within the residential boarding schools. And once again, we need to continue to legitimate the role that sign language has, and to invite these deaf teachers at the boarding schools back into the classroom where they should be.
Yes.
And to empower them to use their skills so that they become, first of all, effective teachers to these deaf kids in teaching, physics, science, history, and so on. And also role models, so that deaf children in Ukraine can see that their future occupations don't have to be limited solely to technical occupations of the kind that the deaf have had in the past in various kinds of factories and so on. But they can also work in the field of education, and in fact can be a lot better at it than perhaps some teachers who don't have the skill level to teach in sign language.
Well, not unlike our Ukrainian bilingual schools or our French immersion schools. Same principle.
Native speakers are, of course, the best. And so I think that Michael was very proud of the way that you've picked up on some of the needs that are there, recognize them, and are again, providing leadership and mentorship to the people who can make a difference in this system in Ukraine. And so I think if we keep chipping away, perhaps at small projects, then we'll make a difference. It does take a few years, but you've been at it now, I think, perhaps 6 or 8 years yourself, so that you're beginning to understand that this cycle, is 10 or 12-year cycle. But certainly, each cycle is at a higher level than the previous one. And I think the vision of deaf students going to universities, the ones who are interested and talented, of course, and graduating from graduate programs at universities in the future in Ukraine is something that one can vision today, thanks to the work that both you and Michael have been doing.
Is there something I should have asked you about Michael that I haven't?
Please do.
So if you had to describe sort of his 3 top characteristics, I mean, you did describe him as a warrior, but if you think about sort of his characteristics that have really carried this work forward, what would those 3 characteristics be?
Well, I would say that this business of persistence and commitment is probably my first choice for him. It's he understood that his life was dedicated to this field, and that seeing the beginning and seeing the end is probably very difficult. We're somewhere in the middle, but you can move that middle point forward. And I think he saw himself in this flow and persisted at it and would not give up. In fact, did not give up to his last moments.
Yes.
So that he was very active. In fact, he came out of hospital to attend the annual general meeting of the Alliance.
Amazing.
His wife and daughter wheeled him, or son, sorry, his son, they wheeled him into the annual meeting, and he stepped down and became past president. And it wasn't long after that he passed away. So persistence is certainly a feature of his life. I would say this. I'm going to mention a little more about this business of warrior because there were times when Michael had to take a position in opposition to others. Perfectly normal when you get to those levels. There are always challenges from either a bureaucracy or a government agency or someone who doesn't understand and doesn't care to understand. And at those times, Michael could be quite firm, was very firm. And he had his battles, but I think those are things that he never took personally. He knew he may have been on one side and someone else on the other, and I witnessed a few of these struggles. He certainly never gave in, but at the same time, he continued to be friends with the people he worked with, even though it might have been a very heated exchange, but he didn't carry grudges or personalize. On the contrary, he was the most generous of individuals. I saw this very much to be the case once when he walked in view and he noticed a girl whose eyes were encrusted and so on. And as I understood what he told me later, he diagnosed her as having a particular kind of condition. And it wasn't dealt with because the family simply didn't have the money to send her to a doctor. So he simply pulled out money out of his wallet and had her go for medical treatment with this diagnosis, and sure enough, it made an enormous difference to this young child. So generosity, is a strong characteristic of his feature.
And generous in so many communities. While his passion was the deaf and hard of hearing community, I mean, certainly in the latter stages of life, he fundraised like crazy through his church for, I think...
The Caribbean. He did the wheelchair project in the
Yes.
Caribbean, and he traveled a lot to the Philippines, so he definitely felt the need of people around the world and broadly, and he did as much as one person can possibly do to contribute to some solutions in these various areas. So, in terms of a third characteristic, there are many things one could say. He was very proud of his family, very committed to young people in general, but he also, I would say, he just had a youthful spirit to him. He loved a good joke. He loved relating to young people. He was just a very unique human being, and I find this is one of the gifts I've received in return for getting engaged with this whole field and with him, is that it's something I've come to understand is the community of the deaf is full of such unique people. And they're just, unique personalities and caring people who, maybe it's because the deaf community takes the time to communicate, actually takes the time to talk, much more than the mainstream society. And so relationships are deeper, more kind of, people know more about each other inside the deaf community. I recognize this because it's also true, not as much, but it's true in the Ukrainian community and other communities. But once you're in one of these communities of commitment, you get to know about other people. It's truly a human kind of experience, and
I like how you've described it in terms of a community of commitment.
Yes.
And that really is the Ukrainian community, the deaf community.
Yes. And and I've come to understand this about communities as a result of these kinds of experiences. Had I not had an opportunity to get involved in the deaf community, I'd be the poorer for it. And so it's been a remarkable element in my sort of experience, professional development, and so on. I've enjoyed it.
We're lucky the two of you met.
Yes.
The two of you have been a power duo for sure in Ukraine. Is there anything that you wish you could have said to Michael that you didn't have a chance to before he left us?
Well, as it happened, I did visit him quite often in the hospital, and we talked about some of these things. I think, I had a chance to express some of these things to him. But I guess I would like his family in particular to appreciate how much he meant to others. He spent a fair amount of time traveling internationally and doing some of these things. And, I guess I'd like his family to know that it was much appreciated by all of us. He's made a very significant development, certainly in my life, but in Ukraine as a country. What was happening in 2001, 2002, through these summer camps, a few thousand people were affected. But some of these things have now become institutionalized, and they're affecting, there's well over 100,000 people who are in the deaf community in Ukraine. They've been reading about Michael and this work in their newspapers and in their publications, at their conferences and so on. And I think that, as I've mentioned before, these are irreversible. Once people have a taste for the freedom to communicate in sign language, or freedom in general, they don't give it up easily. And so Michael has made this gift of freedom to the whole of Ukrainian society. And wherever I have a chance to talk about it in Canada or in Ukraine, I think people are very attentive and appreciative of the significance of breaking such ground, because it took a special personality to put aside all the other work he had. I'm sure there's no shortage of work on his desk, but he put it all aside and just hopped on a plane and jumped into a country that very few of us knew much about at the time. But he did it, and today there are a lot of people that are benefiting from that.
It's a great way to end it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Pleasure.
I appreciate it.
I think it's important that we honor Michael in the way that he was a significant person in history. And I don't know that we'll see another one like Michael for a very long time.
Absolutely. Well, I'm confident we will see. We will see such people, because I recognize them. And as I say, there are many in the deaf community. And but it's true that he broke ground on this of bridging the isolation that the Soviet society had. That's never to be repeated. But in terms of original things yet to be done, oh, there's lots of work.
Thank you, Roman.